topic of tonight's talk is undermining the ego. Before we start, let me get some feedback from you. What do you understand by the word ego? What does it mean to you?
Pride.
Pride. Okay, anyone else?
Own identity.
Own identity. All right. Anyone else?
Not my true self.
Not my true self. Okay.
Well, there's the Western psychology tradition that puts it actually as an important part of your actual
The important
self.
part of yourself.
Your actual self.
Okay. Anyone else? Does everyone agree with these definitions? Because if you don't really understand what it means, then we might not be talking about the same thing, although we use the same word. Any more suggestions?
Something that is totally changeable and doesn't fix from one day to the next.
All right.
Always changing.
It's not changing. That's what the ego is supposed to be.
It
is changing.
It's changing.
It's changing.
Oh, it's changing.
It's always changing.
All right. Okay, let's look at the word anatta. Anatta is a word that's used very often in our Buddhist scriptures, and it's usually translated as not self. I've never seen it been translated as not ego. What does the Buddha mean by not self?
A permanent self?
A permanent self? Let's look at what the Buddha said in the second sermon called the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta that he gave to the 5 bhikkhus. He said, Rupang bhikkhave anatta. Form is anatta, not self. Rupan tidang bhikkhave atta abhavissa. If form were self, natang abadaya samvateya, then it would not conduce to sickness, to disease. Labeta cha evang me rupang hotu evang me rupang ma hositi. And it would be obtainable of form, then we command it, let it be this way and let it be not that way. But because monks, form is anatta, not self, therefore it conduces to sickness, to dis-ease. And therefore it is not obtainable of rupa, of form. Let rupa be this way, let rupa not be this way. Now this applies of course to the other aggregates as well, which are mental in nature. Only form is something material, whereas the others, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara and Vijnana, or in English, feelings, perceptions, volitional formations and consciousness. These 4 aspects of the 5 aggregates are also treated in the same way. From here we can sort of infer the opposite. If it was self, then it would not conduce to dis-ease. If it was self, then we could tell it to do what we want. Right? So this has the implication that the self that the Buddha was trying to deny, the atta, is something that has total control. In his argument, he says that it's because we don't have total control over these 5 aggregates, that's why there's no self. And then in the next section, he asks the monks, what do you think, monks? Is form permanent or impermanent? And he asks the same thing of the other aggregates as well. Is feeling, is perception, volitional formations, is consciousness permanent or impermanent? And the monks answered, impermanent, Bhante. And what is impermanent? Is it sukha or dukkha? I guess you understand what is sukha and dukkha. Dukkha means suffering, and sukha is the opposite of suffering, well, happiness. And the monks answered, dukkha, Bhante. It is suffering. And then the Buddha said, whatever that is impermanent and is suffering, that is subject to change, is it befitting to regard it as etang mama? This is mine. Eso mahasami. That is I. Eso me atta. That is myself. And the monk said, no, Bhante. So let's look at this logic of the Buddha. He's trying to say that whatever is impermanent is suffering. And whatever is impermanent, suffering and subject to change is not self. It's not self, it does not belong to you, it's not you. Now, if we were to try to analyze this from a logical point of view, it doesn't make much sense, does it? But experientially, it does make sense. So from this logical argument of the Buddha, we can get some implications. The first one is that if there were a self, then the atta would be in total control. Secondly, if there were a self, then it would be permanent, not unchanging. And it would not be suffering, it would be happiness. So what the Buddha is trying to deny is that there is a permanent, unchanging self that is always happy. There are also many places in the suttas where the Buddha talked about the self, and he says, Atta dipa bhikkhave viharata, atta sarana, ananya sarana. Monks, be a lamb unto yourself. Take yourself as your own refuge. Don't take any other refuge. And in another verse in the Dhammapada he says, Attahi atano nato. Self is one's own protector. Gohi nato parosiya. Who else can be your protector but yourself? So isn't there an apparent contradiction? On the one hand he says there's no self, and on the other he says you should take yourself as your own refuge. Be a lamb unto yourself.
The second one, he's talking about the mundane self.
Right, that's true. So actually the Buddha is talking on two levels of truth. One is on the level of conventional truth, and one is on the level of ultimate truth. So the Buddha did not deny that there is an empirical self, the mundane self. And indeed he uses the word I and me and you, and he scolds his monks when they misbehave. But what he is denying is that there is no such thing as an unchanging, eternally happy, metaphysical self that is in total control. So when he says not self, that's what he means. Right, although it's very clear that there is an empirical self and there is no metaphysical self, and although we also understand that everything is impermanent, on a gross level, you know that someone is born, he will eventually age and be sick and die. On a more microscopic level, you will know, if you have been keeping abreast of scientific developments, that millions of our cells are dying every moment and new ones are being created. If you go into quantum physics, you will know that the Newtonian physics of the 19th century conceptualized the atom as the smallest particle of matter, is no longer valid. As scientists research more into the nature of the so-called atom, they find that there are so many other subatomic particles. And recently I read an article in the New Scientist which says that latest findings show that even within a proton there are other subatomic particles, and they only comprise 1% of the total mass of the proton. So 99% is emptiness. But you and I are as solid as we can see right now. We also know that our minds are very intricately connected with our bodies. Neuroscientists have confirmed that any mental reaction to any stimulus at any of the six sense doors will immediately trigger off the production of certain amino acids, biochemicals called neuropeptides, particularly from the hypothalamus, which is in the center of the brain. And these neuropeptides will then spread throughout the whole body and affect the healthy cells in our body. Depending on the nature of the mental reaction, you will have a corresponding feeling in your body. Unwholesome states of mind, particularly anger or those associated with unpleasant mental states tend to produce neuropeptides that make us feel miserable. But you all know that everything is impermanent. You know that your thoughts are impermanent. You know that your emotions are impermanent. You may have stopped thinking angry thoughts at a person or about a particular situation, and yet your body still feels miserable. How come? There's an interesting simile of an electric hot plate. If you switch on the electric hot plate, it will take some time for it to heat up. And after you finish your cooking and you turn it off, it will take some time before it can really cool down. It doesn't cool down immediately. It's the same with the mind. Although the mind has stopped thinking unwholesome thoughts, has angry thoughts, it has already stimulated the glands to produce the biochemicals, and they will continue to be produced until they die down. The mind may have stopped thinking bad, unwholesome thoughts, but the body is still producing the neuropeptides, and you're still feeling miserable. So imagine if you have some sort of very deep-seated issues, relationship issues, emotional issues, psychological issues, that you have not been able to address, and you just sweep them under the carpet every now and then. When it surfaces, you react against them, you don't like them. If these unpleasant states of mind arise, they will immediately produce neuropeptides that will spread throughout your body and you will feel miserable. But if you react against these thoughts, disliking them, pushing them away, you don't want to have these angry thoughts anymore. Why don't you just go away? I don't want to think about it anymore. If you have resistance, rejection, then that also is an unwholesome mental state that will produce even more neuropeptides, another round of neuropeptides to the body. Imagine if that is something very chronic and it happens in you for a long time and you've not been able to uproot it. How much harm you're causing to your own body. And that's why a lot of sicknesses and diseases these days are psychosomatic in nature. It's all caused by the mind. Even though you might go for the best medical treatment to address the symptoms, if you don't go to the very root and uproot the main causes, the root causes of the disease, of the ailment, it will come back again. We know that everything is impermanent. We know that millions of cells are dying every moment and new ones are being created. We know that our minds are rising and passing away from moment to moment. They are impermanent. We are not sad all the time. We are not happy all the time. Joy and pleasure come and go. But still we are attached. We read the Buddhist principles and doctrines and we understand that there's no self, there's no permanent, unchanging self. We know that we are not always in control. And yet, we still have this sense of I, the sense of self-identity. We still think that we are the same person that we were this morning. Although some of you might agree that you're not the same person as you were 20 years ago, but you would be more hesitant to say that you're not the same person that you were 2 hours ago, 20 minutes ago, or 20 seconds ago. Why is that so? Why do you think? Why is that so?
That's the memory.
Memory. All right, it's the memory.
Oh, we want something to believe in.
You want something to believe in. All right. So you believe in your thoughts and yourself. Right, okay. That brings us to the subject of ego. Although we can understand and we can accept what the Buddha says about anatta from his second sermon, where we drew some conclusions that he was referring to this self, this metaphysical self that's supposed to be in total control, which is permanent and which is unchanging. We know that there's no such thing. And yet, there is a deeper sense of self that is so inherent in all of us. And what is that based on? We are coming nearer to the ego. But one more thing before we get to the ego. Yesterday, Sinjira asked about a sotapan? How does someone know that one becomes a stream enterer? And one of the fetters that the stream enterer has abandoned or uprooted is a belief in self, a belief in a permanent, unchanging self. Although a sotapanna, a stream enterer, has really abandoned or uprooted this belief, this view that there is a permanent, unchanging self, he's still suffering from attachment to the ego. That's why asmi mana. Asmi mana is a Pali word. Asmi means I am, and mana means conceit. The sense of I am can only be uprooted by an arahant, the one who is fully enlightened. Not even by an anagami, but only by an arahant. So this sense of I am, as long as it's there, we cannot get away from the ego. Because that's what the ego is all about. It's how we identify with all these. I'm going to talk about the structure of the ego. Has any of you read Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now? Anyone heard about this?
Bits and pieces.
You know? Have you heard of Eckhart Tolle in the first place? No. Okay, all right. He wrote another book after that. It's called The New Earth, where he talks a lot about the ego. And I find it so interesting because being a Westerner, he could investigate and describe it so vividly. Anyway, let's come back to the structure of the ego. The structure of the ego is that it thrives on identification. Identifying with your thoughts and emotions. Remember, in the second sermon, the Buddha reminded the monks, if everything is impermanent, is suffering and subject to change, then it's not worth regarding them as mine or I or myself, my ego. And following that, the Buddha said, therefore monks, whatever form or feelings or perceptions or volitional formations or consciousness there are, whether in the present, the past or the future, whether it's refined or coarse, whether it's near or far, whether it's sublime or otherwise, all of these should be regarded as not mine, not I, not myself, not my ego. Now, it's interesting because here we can now look into how Buddhist wisdom arises. And there are three levels. The first level is, in Pali, it's called Sutta Maya Panya. It's an intelligence that arises from listening or reading, gathering information from somebody else. So that's sort of a second-hand knowledge. And this Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, the second sermon on the characteristic of not self, is precisely this first level. The Buddha was trying to tell the monks that this is such. The five aggregates are impermanent, they are suffering, they are subject to change, and therefore they should not be regarded as mine or I or myself. And then after that the Buddha said, therefore monks, you should view all of these five aggregates, whether they are the past, present or future, whether they are in your presence or in your absence, etc., as not mine, not I, not myself. This is the second stage. That is application of what you learn to your experience. Right? What does that mean? It means that when you have thoughts, you do not identify with the thoughts. You don't just believe those thoughts. Thoughts are just thoughts. They're not you. They're not yours. They arise because of causes and conditions. The teachings of the Buddha can be summed up in the Four Noble Truths, the three characteristics, and the law of dependent origination. The Buddha said that there is suffering, the cause of suffering is desire or craving, and there is an end to suffering, and there is a way that leads to the end of suffering, which is the Noble Eightfold Path. Right? Part of the Noble Eightfold Path, uses this concept of the three characteristics to observe phenomena. Phenomena that we can perceive through our senses are to be observed in terms of anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, suffering, and not self. And as you observe that again and again, you are actually reprogramming, reformatting your mind. Because we have been brought up to think that there is an I. The ego has actually been created from the moment we were born, created by your parents, the society, as well as yourself. You are creating an image of yourself, of what you think you should be, or what you think what others think you are, or what you should be. Many years ago when I was in high school, taking my A-levels, I had one very innovative teacher teaching us one paper called General Paper. And he gave us some readings based on Erich Fromm and Carl Rogers. At that time, in the 70s, they were quite famous psychologists. One of the messages of Erich Fromm was, be yourself, don't try to be what you're not. At that time, I haven't started meditation yet, but I was thinking, who am I? And I found that this so-called I is actually made up of selected memories. Right? Some things you want, some things you don't want. And you pick out those things that you want and you piece them together and say, this is I. Right? Or you may be a bit perverted and you take out those bad qualities and put it in as well and say, this is I as well. So you are made up of a selection of memories that you like and you dislike, and you piece them up together and you say, this is I. Right? It's just a thought. You know that this body is impermanent, you know that intellectually. You don't see that actually. So let's come back to the Buddhist development of wisdom, of intelligence. First step is to gather information, and that's by listening to the Dhamma talk. In those days, they didn't have any books, or they didn't have any MP3 players or tape recorders, so you had to listen to a live talk by someone. But nowadays, you can listen to MP3 records, you can watch DVDs, you can read books, or you can attend a live talk like tonight. And that's the time when you gather the information that in fact everything is impermanent, there's no self. After you gather that information, you have to apply it in your daily life. Some years ago, in 1984, when I went with Sayadaw Pandita to the US, to the Insight Meditation Society in Barre, Massachusetts, we had a 3-month retreat. I was there as an interpreter, as a translator. At that time, a Harvard professor in psychology conducted an experiment on the yogis there. He was trying to quantify the effects of mindfulness practice on one's mental ability or capability. So what he used was a T-scope. Any physicists around here? Any scientists around here? You know what's a T-scope? A T-scope is like a radar screen. One can actually manipulate a spark inside there. You can spark and control the rate of sparking. You could have 1 spark per second, 2 sparks per second, 1 spark in a quarter of a second, 1 spark in 1 millisecond, 1 spark in a microsecond. So what he did was, he would take some subjects and put them to this test before the retreat. And so each of us has his or her own threshold level. Maybe it's about 1 spark per millisecond. If it's faster than that, you only see 1 spark instead of 2. So each person has got his own threshold. So he took the readings before the retreat, and at the end of the 3-month retreat, he took readings again. And he found that in some of those more advanced yogis, there was an increase in the threshold of 500%. What they saw as 1 spark before the retreat, now they saw the beginning, the middle, and the ending of the first spark, and there's a gap in between, and the beginning, the middle, and the end of the next spark. Do you know that if you have a fluorescent lamp here, a fluorescent lamp is actually working on AC, alternating current, right? And it's actually fluctuating. It's going on and off at a rate of about, I think, 60 times per second. But you don't see that fluctuation. You think that the light is on all the time. But it's because they have gone through that course of meditative practice where they have sharpened their concentration and their attentiveness, that they are able to perceive impermanence on a more minute scale. I'm not saying that all of you must do that. When one is able to perceive impermanence on a micro scale like that, it has a greater impact on your mindset and your worldview. When you are able to see things arising and passing away on such a microscopic level, then you will be less prone to attachment, to false expectations, or to high expectations, or unrealistic expectations. Because expectations are the cause of a lot of suffering, right? A lot of times you are frustrated, you are disappointed, you are sad because your expectations are not met. When we understand that things arise and pass away from moment to moment, then we are cautious when we make expectations. It's not that we don't make any more expectations, we still make expectations, but we know that they are subject to change. And we don't cling so much to the end result. And that helps to ease suffering. But what is even faster than matter is mind. Our mind works even faster than matter. But it's actually not that very difficult to watch how the mind changes as it is to watch how matter changes on that microscopic level. In order to watch or observe all these particles arising and passing away at such a microscopic level, you need to develop concentration and mindfulness for. But watching the mind is not that difficult, although it's faster. Initially, we do not really watch the mind. We do not really watch consciousness in the true sense of the word. Now that I use the word consciousness, perhaps I need to explain to you what consciousness means in the context of the 5 aggregates. In the 5 aggregates, we have form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. The first of the 5 aggregates, form, is something material. But the other 4 are all mental in nature. Now, feeling is something not volitional. And when we say feeling, we mean something mental. Although it could be something physical in the sense that you feel in your body. But that feeling of whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable arises because of body consciousness. This floor here, this timber floor, would not have any feeling because it doesn't have consciousness. It's only when consciousness is there can it be aware of what is good, bad, or neutral, what is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. But there's no choice to it. It's not something volitional. You don't choose pain or pleasure. It comes and you just are aware of it. Sanya or perception also works in a similar way. It's not something volitional. Memory, for example. There are 2 aspects of memory. One is the passive memory and one is the active memory. Passive memory is like when you look at something and immediately you recognize it. You don't need to actually exert any effort to recall. In fact, sometimes this passive memory can be quite a hindrance because we are so conditioned to think, to perceive things in a certain way, even though what we see is not what we think it is, automatically we perceive it in that way because of our past conditioning. Now, volitional formations are those other factors of the mind that are connected with volition, with intention. So the active part of memory is like when you try to recollect something, to recall something. It's not a spontaneous recognition of something, but it's like, where did I put my keys this morning? Right? And you start to think, well, could it be here, could it be there? And when you try to recollect, that is active recollection. That is something volitional. So that's part of volitional formations. It's not part of perception. Perception is when you look at something and immediately you recognize it without any effort. That is perception. And consciousness is actually just the bare knowing of something. It has a special sense in our Buddhist terminology. For example, we have eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, and body consciousness from the Buddhist point of view. Eye consciousness can only see colors. It cannot hear sounds. And tongue consciousness can only taste. It cannot hear nor see. It has a very specific function, just to know a certain type of object. Body consciousness can only be aware of certain sensations in the body. Hot and cold, hot and soft, movement, tension, pressure, tingling sensations, vibrations, and so forth. But they cannot hear, nor see, nor taste, nor smell. So each of these 5 consciousnesses are very specific in their functions. They can only know one particular thing. There is an interesting simile used to describe, to relate feeling, perception, and volitional formations to consciousness. It's like a glass of water. A glass of pure water would be colorless, right? And that can be compared to consciousness. And then you put in some dye. It can become yellow or red or purple or magenta or whatever. But still, the water is there. So the feeling, perception, and volitional formations can be compared to the dye. The various types of dye that you put in to color that solution. Consciousness is the bare knowing, whereas the other aspects of the 5 aggregates, the mental aspects of the 5 aggregates are like the dye. They color your consciousness. The 5 aggregates can be viewed as arranged in an order according to subtlety. Form is rather gross, right? Form here means material qualities. When you sit, you feel all these physical sensations that you would have felt just now when we started off the session. And then in the course of a meditation, you will be assailed by a lot of memories of what you did in the past, this morning, this afternoon. You try to meditate, these thoughts will come in, drift in and drift out. So that is memory, perception. And then you have volitional formations, like trying to put in effort to observe what is happening, reminding yourself, I'm supposed to be meditating, I'm not supposed to be thinking of this and that, trying to bring your attention back to whatever you're supposed to watch. And finally, when you arrive at a state of no thought in your meditation, no more thinking. For most of us, our thoughts are very verbal in nature. They are made of words and sentences, and maybe pictures. As you go through deeper levels of meditation, you can get to a stage where there are no more thoughts, no more verbal, discursive thinking. But there's consciousness still there. There's still awareness of what is happening and knowing how things are related, but there are no thoughts. And that's consciousness, bare awareness. There could even be awareness of hearing consciousness. But you may not be able to recognize what sound it is in deep meditation. You just know that there's hearing. But sometimes you will need to reflect on what that sound is, because recognition doesn't come immediately, because you're in that sort of meditative mode. You've gone beyond concepts. Okay, so when I'm talking about watching the mind, we don't start off by trying to watch consciousness because it's something very subtle. How do we know that we are thinking? It's because of the subject matter of the thought, right? The content of the thought. You're thinking of this subject, and then suddenly you change and you're thinking of another subject, and you know that, oh, this is one thought and that's a different thought, because the subject matter has changed. But even awareness of how thoughts come and go due to different contents can give us an insight into impermanence and the conditionality of phenomena. If you are able to see your thoughts arise and pass away due to immediate causes and conditions that can reinforce or reaffirm your view about anatta, about not self. Because thoughts come and go, not because you purposely want to think those thoughts, but those thoughts arise due to causes and conditions. If you are able to pinpoint those particular causes and conditions, then you can see anatta very clearly, even on a conceptual level. But most of the time, we are lost in thought. And it's very difficult for us to extract ourselves from the thoughts and be a third-party observer and try to just watch things come and go. As somebody asked last night, daily life, you have so many things to do and think about. How can you practice just watching your breath? That would be impractical. In order for us to be able to extract ourselves from getting lost in our thoughts, we need to have some reference point. We need to have an anchor or reference point. There is an interesting English saying, come back to your senses. And that's what we have done. We have printed this in a t-shirt. I wonder whether you can read this. Yeah, at the top it says, lost in thought, come back to your senses. You see that? Okay, let me explain what it means. Our five senses, our five-sense consciousness, eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, and body consciousness can only take present objects which are right in front of you right now. You can't see something which you saw this morning which is not right in front of you, right? Neither can you hear something which you're going to hear tomorrow, the vibrations of which are not here. But when you're fast asleep at night and your five senses are shut down, you can have a wonderful dream where you're in a disco, dancing, having a nice time. Or you could be chased, you could feel that you are being pursued by robbers and you'll be running for your life and panting, and then you suddenly wake up in a nightmare and find that your heart is throbbing. Right? So who is doing that? It's the mind. Yeah? In Buddhism, we talk about six senses. The five senses and the sixth sense, which is the mind. So we have eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness. And it is mind consciousness that is the culprit. Whatever that we can perceive through our five senses are actually just raw data. It's just like the 1 and the 0 that you key into your computer. It's all raw data. If you do not have a software to be able to interpret those data and process them, it's useless. So it's the same with us. The mind for us is the software that interprets all these raw data that we receive. And this software is a result of conditioning, programming. You have been programmed, you have been conditioned by a wide variety of causes and conditions. Right from the moment you were born, you were conditioned by your parents, your family, your environment, your school, the mass media, by your peers, by your religious views and opinions and beliefs. And all of these conditions interact and combine in a very intricate way to produce a thought. And this could come out because of a particular catalyst. For example, you're walking along the street during lunchtime, come down from your office and walking to a place to have your lunch. And along the way as you walk, you chance across someone who looks like someone you knew. And immediately the mind will trigger off a memory of this person, and probably an incident or an occasion that you had with this particular person, whether it's something pleasant or unpleasant. And that could also trigger off a whole train of other thoughts. Yeah? So this is the direct catalyst that triggers off the production of a thought. It is not you who deliberately thought that way. It is because the eye consciousness came into contact with a certain visual object, and then your mind consciousness interpreted it, and then from there it went on to proliferate into thoughts about the past. And perhaps also about the future, how you're going to relate to this person again. Now, what I'm trying to encourage is for you to continually remind yourself to watch your mind. And to make use of these 5 senses as the reference point, as the anchor. Because they are only concerned with present objects. Whereas the mind consciousness can think of things of the past, future, and present, as well as concepts and fantasies and imaginations, plans and so forth. But I'm not telling you to do that all the time, because you still have to work, you have responsibilities, you have to think, to carry out your assignments. Yet, although you say that you work 8 hours a day, you don't really do so. From the moment you get up in the morning until you sit down on your desk, how many hours is that? Can somebody tell me how many hours? 2 hours. Right. Within that 2 hours, your mind is thinking also. But you may not be thinking about work. You may be thinking about the family. You may be thinking about how to get to work on time and so forth. And even within that so-called 8 hours that you're supposed to be working, lots of time you are not actually actively involved in your work. You're preparing your desk, chatting with a friend, you're walking to the toilet, you're in the toilet. All this time, a lot of idle chatter is going on in your mind. Walking from your house to the car park, from the car park to your office, you can actually practice watching the mind, coming back to your senses. Be aware of your walking process, for example. The cold wind blowing in your skin, the touch of your skin with your clothing, the movements of your legs. Be aware of what you see in front of you, what you hear. Be aware of the total surrounding, and ask yourself, if you are not with the 5 senses, what's the mind doing? The moment you realize that it's lost in thought, come back to your senses. This is a very, very simple principle, and it's far more difficult to remember to put it into practice. Back in Taiping in Malaysia, I have this beginner's class every Saturday night. I teach the locals there. And I always tell them, if you have any problems with insomnia at night, you don't have to resort to tranquilizers. I can give you a very simple FOC method of overcoming insomnia. And it's based on this principle. If you're lost in thought, come back to your senses. So what you need to do is, if you have insomnia, lie down on your bed and just relax your whole body. Just try to be aware of the bodily sensations. Your head in contact with the pillow, your shoulders in contact with the bed, your clothes in contact with your body, various parts of your body in contact with various parts of the bed. And every time your mind runs off, bring it back slowly. Every time you reject the thought, observe the rejection, let it go. It's not yours. Come back to bodily sensations, or you could be just listening to sound, even to the tick-tock of the clock. Anything that brings you to the present moment. The reason why people cannot sleep is they are thinking about certain issues that they have not been able to resolve. Right? And these are issues of the past or future. Right? And in order to stop the mind from thinking, it's very simple. Replace the contents. Replace the subject matter. That's another nature of the mind. Another characteristic of the mind is that it must always have an object. A mind without an object is no mind. There's no mind without an object. A mind arises together with an object that it is aware of. So if it's caught up and lost in thought, it's very simple. Substitute the object with the present one of the 5 sense objects. And then you will not be bothered with things of the past anymore, or of the future. And remember, earlier on when we started this session, we went through this process of relaxation. Throughout the whole day in your life, it's very good practice, very good habit to come back, to have this body awareness, to check and see whether there is any tension in your body. Anytime. And if there's tension, you consciously relax. And I promise you, by relaxing your body, it will also have an effect on your mind. So, the structure of the ego is to identify with thoughts. This is my thought, this is my emotion. I don't want to have this thought. How come it's coming up again? That's an identification with your thoughts. When we practice watching our thoughts, using the five senses as our reference point, we are undermining the ego. You're not giving the chance for the ego to identify with the thoughts, because we are seeing that these thoughts are arising and passing away due to certain causes and conditions. Is it because of something I saw, something I heard, something I tasted during my lunch that reminded me of a sumptuous dinner that I had with my former girlfriend, whatever? So you can see all these thoughts, they don't belong to you. They're not yours. They arise because of causes and conditions. And the important thing is to be able to watch the immediate cause. At the beginning, it may not be so obvious, but later on, with continued practice, you will be able to pinpoint the exact cause and condition for the arising of this thought. Many times it's because of particular sense objects. Someone you saw, something you taste, something you hear, sound or a word, or something you read. But sometimes it may not be because of the five sense objects. It could be because of some deep-seated issues that have not been resolved, and they could just pop up. Again, if they pop up out of the blue, it's not yours. You didn't ask it to come. You can also see that it is not yours. So, we must apply this second step along the way to Buddhist knowledge and wisdom. The first step is to gather information, and that's what I'm doing now. I'm giving you all this information. I'm programming your mind. Yeah? And then you go back to apply this information to your daily life, particularly to your thoughts. It will be helpful also if you can allocate some time to do some formal practice, like what Bhante ji recommended yesterday. Get some time off to do some concentration practice, watch your breath, settle your mind. And when the mind is more settled, then it's easier for it to detach itself from thoughts and look at things more objectively. Now, when we're talking about causes and conditions, we are not only talking about immediate causes. As I said initially, you might not be able to see even the immediate cause. With practice, you can see the immediate cause. And with further practice, you can see even deeper causes far back in history. As long as we do not understand the causes and conditions for our habitual reactions, we are always a slave to them. If you want to undo bad habits, habitual reactions, you need to understand their causes. And that will come not through intellectual reasoning, but through an insight as you observe the movement of the mind throughout the day. The important thing is to remind yourself to watch the mind every now and then. You know, when you're not involved in doing something for your livelihood or for your family, at times when your mind is in the idle mode with a lot of idle chatter going on, then you can make use of that idle chatter as organic manure, fertilizer for growing the tree of wisdom. Turn it back. Look at those thoughts. Don't identify with those thoughts. They are not me, they are not mine, they are not myself. These are just thoughts, these are just emotions, these are just perceptions that arise and fall away due to causes and conditions. As we go deeper into daily practice, we can even understand how our views and opinions come about. It becomes very obvious to us that our views and opinions are based on a lot of assumptions which cannot be proven at that point of time. When we realize that, it makes us humble and we're not so assertive. That doesn't mean that we become diffident. We can still be confident, but we can be confident in a humble way. Whatever decisions that we make at this point of time are all based on this view and this opinion, which is based on certain assumptions which cannot be proven at this point of time. But decisions have to be made anyway. So we are making these decisions based on these assumptions. But along the way, things may change. Our assumptions may be proven wrong. We may have newer discoveries that need to make us redefine our expectations. That is also undermining the ego, because the ego likes to associate or identify with views and opinions. People get involved in an argument or a debate because of the ego clinging to a view. Right? This is my view. If you identify that view and that opinion with yourself, then you're asking for trouble. Because if somebody were to attack or to criticize that view and opinion, because it's yours, your ego is hurt. But if you regard that view and opinion as just another view and opinion based on certain assumptions, if somebody comes to challenge it, then you can be very objective and say, okay, that's another view, let's talk about it. And maybe he gives you some reasonable explanations about how the assumption is wrong, and he might give a better set of assumptions, then why not? We can change it for the better to get a more accurate picture. During the Buddha's time, a Brahmin approached a monk, Aggacitta. He says, Bhante, why do householders fight and quarrel with one another? And the Venerable answered, well, it's because of clinging, attachment, and craving for pleasures of the senses, sense objects. And then why do monks, renunciants, quarrel and argue among themselves? Because they're supposed to have renounced all these worldly pleasures. Then the Venerable said it's because of attachment to views. So attachment is a culprit. It doesn't matter what object it takes, whether it's sense objects or whether it's views and opinions. As long as there's attachment, that is going to be the cause of suffering. Okay, let's look at another two aspects of the ego. One is comparing, and the other one is criticizing. The ego loves to compare. I'm better than you. I'm equal to you. Oh, I'm such an inferior person. I'm useless. I'm inadequate. That's the work of the ego. It's doing all the talking. It also likes to criticize. Oh, look at that guy. Can't even do the job straight. Doesn't he have the common sense to do it that way and this way? The ego is more concerned with opinions and interpretations rather than with facts. So as long as we do not identify with our thoughts, our views and opinions, we are able to stand back and look at them as objective phenomena. We are undermining the ego. Because that's what the ego feeds on. That's how it survives. Identification. In England and in Australia also, there's one type of mindfulness-based psychotherapy called acceptance and commitment therapy that is becoming very popular. It has got certain principles involved, and I have made use of these principles and made an acronym to explain how it works. The acronym is DABOPA, the BOPA. D means to disidentify from your thoughts and emotions. And A means to accept. When a negative thought or emotion has already arisen within you, accept it for what it is. It has already arisen. The moment you try to reject it, or to regret, or be remorseful, you are reacting. And that is another round of neuropeptides to be produced. So you accept things for what they are. Oh, okay, this thought has arisen and is producing all these neuropeptides in the body. I'm going to suffer for the next few minutes. That's it. Okay, I accept it. Don't try to push it away. Because the moment you try to push it away, you're creating even more neuropeptides, and you're going to suffer even more, longer. So the second principle is to accept for what they are. The third principle, B, is be present. Come back to your senses. You have this angry thought, it's upsetting you, and you have all these sensations that are produced in the body because of the neuropeptides. Now, stop thinking the thought. Don't think about the contents of the thought. Come back to just watch bodily sensations. There's an ache here, there's throbbing, congestion in the chest, all heated up. Be aware of these physical sensations. If there are any reactions to these physical sensations, I want them to go away. Be aware of that too. That is another thought. And don't identify with the physical sensations. They are also not yours. You didn't ask them to arise in the first place. They came up, they arose because of this thought that arose also because of other causes and conditions. Right? So, be present is the third principle. And the next principle is observe the self, or observe not self for us Buddhists. Which means that you are trying to look back on the mind that is aware of what's happening in an objective way. This mind that is aware of the anger, this mind that is aware of those unpleasant physical sensations happening in your body, is unaffected by your anger, is unaffected by the unpleasant sensations. It seems to be neutral, because that's mindfulness and full awareness. They cannot go together. You cannot be mindful when you're angry. But the mind works so fast, sometimes you might be angry and you're mindful, and you're angry again, you're mindful, and you're angry again, you're mindful. You might just be going back and forth and see which one wins, which one is more powerful. So to observe this state of mind that is unaffected by all these things, and to take solace in that, at least this part of the saner mind that's not getting involved in all this. But even that state of mind is a conditioned phenomena. That is not I, that is not self, that is not an eternal self. That arose because you were programmed to do so. You read about it, you came to this talk tonight, and that memory was one of the causes and conditions for you to arouse that third-party awareness of what's happening. Right, so this seems to work in a meditative situation. But if you're in the world, you need to act. So that's why this ACT is getting to be very popular nowadays, because it addresses also more conceptual, worldly things. After you disidentify, accept, be present and observe not self, next thing you do is to personalize your values. All of us have a set of our own values. What do you want to achieve in life? And you have to be more objective and try to find out exactly what you want to do. Is that you have some negative aspects of you that you want to improve on, to develop. Maybe you're not a good parent, you're not a caring spouse, and you want to become a caring spouse, a more responsible parent. Then you are supposed to identify that and list concrete steps that you would like to take. And then you act. The last one is to act according to those principles. One of the psychotherapists shared his experience with one of his clients. So this client was suffering from low self-esteem. And he came in, the psychotherapist asked him to lie down on the couch and relaxed him and said, okay, what's your problem? And he said, well, I feel lousy. I'm inadequate. I never succeed in anything. He said, all right, close your eyes. And how do you know that you are lousy? Well, because I see the thought, I am lousy. As I said, our thoughts are very verbal in nature. Can you spell it out for me? Yeah, it's I-A-M-L-O-U-S-Y. Right, he says, good. Now change the font. From Times New Roman, he changed it to Helvetica or to Arial Black. And after that, he says, all right, italicize it and change its color. And and after a while, this guy was laughing and having fun. Yeah. So this is one of those creative ways that these psychotherapists have conjured up to help their patients disidentify from their thoughts. Right? This is just a thought, and you can play around with it. After all, the lesson is that we should not simply believe every thought that we have. We should question the thought. Ask ourselves, where does this thought come from? Where does this view, this opinion, where does it come from? What is it based on? I mean, I'm encouraging you to do that when your mind is on idle mode, right? I'm not asking you to question your boss all the time, okay? You follow orders when you're at work. When you're in idle mode and your mind is having all this useless chatter going around, all these comments, you can make use of that as organic fertilizer for your organic garden of wisdom. So all this comparing, criticizing is also based on identification. So the more we can disidentify from our thoughts and emotions, views and opinions, the more we can comprehend the immediate causes and conditions as well as their historical causes and conditions. We are in a better position to undermine the ego and live a more fulfilling and contented life. Because most of the times our suffering comes from the ego, clinging to this illusory, non-existing self-image of ourselves. Okay, let's stop my talk here and let's open to the floor for discussion. Any comments or any questions?
The day that you lose your identity, you become nobody. Or you become everybody, anybody. Like you become a commoner. Probably the day that you lose your ego, your dukkha and everything, probably you attain Nibbana or something like that. Maybe it is something that get rid of ego, you getting very, very close to what your aim is.
Mm-hmm. That was what I was trying to explain just now. I was saying that the Sotapanna, or the stream enterer, has already eradicated the view that there is an entity, a permanent self behind these five aggregates. But it's only a view because he still has conceit in him. I am, the sense of I am is still in him, and this can only be eradicated when one becomes an arahant. Right, so this self-identity that you're talking about is actually like what I'm trying to say, identifying with your thoughts and emotions, with your body as you, as yourself, belonging to you. But we already know intellectually that they don't belong to you. When you're having a sickness and you're attacked by viruses and bacteria, are you the one telling your immune system how much antibodies to produce, at what rate, at which part of the body? No, right? It's going on by itself. You got no choice. It's not yours. If you age, you cannot stop yourself from aging. When you are eating something, you're not telling your glands in your mouth to produce certain enzymes, nor are you telling your stomach to produce certain enzymes to digest vegetables and to digest fruits and to digest carbohydrates and proteins. They're all different enzymes, but the body knows what to produce and how much to produce. And it's not within your consciousness at all. You don't even know what's happening. So actually we all know intellectually that there's no self. There's nothing here that is in total control. They are all due to causes and conditions. But it's because we do not see from a moment-to-moment basis, if we have not integrated it into our daily life, to see how our mind works, to see how our mind tries to identify with our thoughts. The moment we can see how the mind works, trying to identify and cling to thoughts and ideas and opinions and views, then we can also see how these thoughts and views arise and pass away due to causes and conditions. That is undermining the ego. You're not giving a chance for the ego to cling to because there's nothing there. Like pulling the carpet under the ego.
So as soon as you actually begin to experience that, you change.
Right.
A great joy comes about.
Yes.
A great liberation, freedom.
Yes.
You don't have to wait till you've removed every ounce of that before that state arises.
Right, right. In fact, every thought moment, you understand this particular thought. You can see how it arises immediately and how it goes away, and you can see it doesn't belong to you. At that very moment itself, it's very freeing and liberating. You don't have to wait until you become a Sotapanna or an Arahant to enjoy that freedom. But what I'm encouraging is that you should try to integrate that into as many aspects of your life as possible. I have an interesting thing to share. Some years ago, one of my students introduced me to a software that's called Break Reminder. If you're using Apple, there's another one that's called Timeout. This is a software that you can install for free into your computer, and you can program it in such a way that it will blank out your screen at maybe every 10 minutes for maybe 12 seconds or 15 seconds. Actually, it's also good for your health, because staying too long in front of the computer causes health problems. So these things will you'll blank out your computer and you're forced to come back to the moment. So what you do is every 10 minutes for 12 seconds, you're back in the present moment. Stop your thinking, come back to your senses, and just be aware of what the mind is doing. So if you're sitting in front of the computer for long hours, this is very interesting, because it programs your mind to come back to the present moment every 10 minutes. And when you get off the computer and you're back in your daily life, the momentum of that also goes on in your mind. So every 10 minutes or so, you come back to the present moment. That's making use of modern technology to help you in mindfulness practice. It's also a training in discipline, yeah? Because you have a choice. When it blanks out, you have a choice either to resume or to wait until the full 12 seconds are over. So if you don't have the discipline, you just click it and it goes off again and you're back at work. And I find it very useful because it helps me to detach even from a very compelling idea that I'm working on. Suddenly it's off, good, detachment. Set back, be aware of my bodily sensations, be aware of the sounds around me, just for 12 seconds, and then it comes back again and back at work. So this will assist you in going in and out of ultimate reality and conceptual reality. Okay, anyone else? Yes.
Is it a spiritual ego to believe the thought that this life we can complete Buddha's teaching?
The question is it a spiritual ego to think that within this life one can complete the Buddha's teaching? Wow, become an arahant in this life?
Hopefully.
I think one should also be careful when one makes vows. There's one particular case of a student in Malaysia. He attended a talk and he was so inspired by the talk that he made a vow that he wanted to repay all his karmic debts in this very lifetime. And soon after that he got cancer for no reason. And so the parents were very distraught and frantic, and they asked for advice. And I said the first thing to do is to ask him to revoke that determination, that aspiration. Why are you in such a hurry? Take your time. You can make a wish that you want to become an arahant as soon as possible in the most comfortable way. Because if you want to become an arahant in this life, imagine, so much karma that we have done in the past, and the beginning of samsara is inconceivable. You have to repay all those debts before you can become an arahant. Let me share with you some experiences regarding people who practice meditation, samatha and vipassana. There are many cases, but I'll just relate one particular case to you, one of my students. He's actually a gangster, the gangster head. And he used to tell me that the police are scared of gangsters, but gangsters are scared of holy men. So now he's our security officer. When I conducted my first retreat in Taiping, there was back in 2000, I think, or 2001. He wanted to join my retreat, and I said, okay, good, come, fine. And he came into the retreat, and I taught him vipassana. As is usual, many meditation teachers have also confirmed this. If you're a police officer or you're a thug or a gangster, when you do vipassana meditation, you go through a lot of suffering. And in the course of his meditation, he felt as though people were kicking him and beating him all over, and he couldn't bear with that torment. So he complained to me, and I said, well, you have to go through this, you have to go through this. It's part of your karma. You have to pay your karmic debt. But he could not go through it. And I said, okay, never mind. You stop doing vipassana and you just do metta meditation. And the moment you switch to metta, all the pain all disappeared. This also happened. There's one story I read from Ajahn Charan, Longpo Charan, Singpuri, Wat Amphowan. You've heard of him? Very famous now. Ajahn Charan. Well, this is the story of a Vietnamese monk. He was actually a butcher when he was a layperson. He never had any faith in Buddhist monks or in Buddhism, but very strangely he had a very strong connection to a forest monk, a particular forest monk whom he attended to and served. And this forest monk encouraged him to change his occupation, stop being a butcher and to renounce. And eventually he did renounce. He renounced and became a forest monk. At that time he was practicing Buddho, just samatha, staying in the forest, just practicing Buddho for a couple of years. And in the forest, a deva appeared and said, "Look, you have done a lot of bad karma in the past, and by doing just this, you won't get out of samsara. You have to repay your karmic debt in order to make progress in your meditation. Why don't you go and see Ajahn Charan in Wat Amphowan in Singpuri?" And this monk was up in the north, and he says, "I haven't heard of this place before, I don't know how to get there." And the deva says, "Don't worry, I'll guide you there." And so this deva guided him all the way to Ajahn Charan's place, Wat Amphowan in Singpuri. And this Vietnamese monk was practicing under Longpo. At that time, Longpo was also holding a meditation camp for some university students. And so this forest monk camped outside the meditation hall. And one day when he was going through this stage of his practice, he was rolling on the floor, screaming as though he was being cut to pieces. But he had the endurance and the courage to go through that experience with Longpo's encouragement, of course. After that, he made quite good progress in his meditation. Eventually, he went back to Vietnam and started a meditation center there. And according to what I read in Longpo's account, after a few years he disappeared because he wanted to do his own practice and nobody heard about him anymore. Yeah, so what I'm trying to say is that if you do Vipassana meditation, be prepared to pay your karmic debts. Yeah, and if you make a vow, be realistic. Okay, and make an aspiration, be realistic.